So nice to see you. Welcome to our program this afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. I am Carrie Cooper, Dean of University Libraries. And while the pandemic has been challenging for many, it has forced new ways of engaging alumni and friends of William and Mary. It has been a pleasure partnering with the Alumni Association and Friends to bring you excellent programs that introduce us to books, many of which are written by our talented alumni. And today we are very excited to have with us Sarah Glosson, who is a Triple Crown graduate, 98, 09, and 15. And today she's going to be discussing her book, Performing Jane, A Cultural History of Jane Austen Fandom. And first, before we introduce her, and I pass the mic to Kim Wheatley, Professor Wheatley, I'm going to mention a few housekeeping items. The first is, if you see the three dots in the top of your Zoom box, if you click on that, you can rename yourself to put where you're actually Zooming from. You can put your first name and where you're at. That would be great. It's nice to see where people are at. That's fun for us. The other thing is you can keep your video on because it is fun. It's especially fun for Sarah because I know she sees lots of friends and family and people that she knows out there. And it makes it fun for her to be able to look out and see you. But feel free to also turn off your video if you'd like. We've muted all of your microphones for Sarah's talk, so we don't have any disruptions. And you may want to change to speaker view for the talk so that you can best see Sarah. And lastly, we will have time after the talk for Q&A. So you can use the chat box for the questions that you have today. And Tammy and Professor Wheatley will be monitoring the chat box and making sure that Sarah has plenty of questions to answer during that time. And now I'd like to invite Professor Wheatley, Professor of English at William and Mary, to introduce Sarah.
Thank you, Carrie. I'm delighted to introduce Sarah Glosson, who I first encountered 10 years ago in her role as the manager of the Williamsburg Youth Orchestra. Sarah wears multiple hats. Sarah received her Ph.D. in American Studies from William and Mary in 2015, and her doctoral dissertation actually formed the basis of the book that she's going to talk about today. For the past 5 years, she has been director of the Arts and Sciences Graduate Center here at William and Mary, where she oversees professional development and academic success initiatives in support of graduate students across arts and sciences. Carrie already mentioned the title of Sarah's book, Performing Jane. In the book, Sarah explores the long history of Austen fandom, arguing that the activities of Austen fans are fundamentally performative and reaffirming of the value of Austen. Very positive. She explores a range of practices by Janeites, and in the words of cultural historian Daniel Cavici, quote, makes a significant contribution to historical fan studies, analyzing Janeites' meaning-making across print, media, and digital worlds. I've already had the pleasure of hearing Sarah present her research at the Williamsburg Public Library in the past, and as a teacher of Jane Austen myself, I am of course fascinated by her topic. I can testify to the blurred line between Austen fandom and the academic study of Jane Austen. As a member of JASNA, Jane Austen Society of North America, I can also testify that the JASNA AGM is quite a scene. I, of course, ran into Sarah at the AGM held here in Williamsburg in 2019, where she was no doubt studying the goings-on with an eagle eye. For the past 5 years, Sarah has given an annual guest lecture in my Jane Austen class in a session in special collections at SWEM Library. My students had the opportunity to handle and examine the trove of material donated by George Holbert Tucker, a local biographer of Austen. No relation to the Tucker of Tucker Hall, I think, not anyway. Quite a few of my students said the session led by Sarah was the highlight of the semester. And I'm glad to see at least one of my present students here as well. Please join me in welcoming Sarah Glosson.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Wheatley, for that really kind introduction. I'm suddenly feeling very emotional. I see all these people from my entire life in this Zoom call, and it's just almost overwhelming. So thank you so much for being here. I'd particularly like to thank everyone at William and Mary Libraries for this. Has been a terrific series, so make sure you keep an eye on the other talks that come up in this series. Thanks in particular to Dean Carrie Cooper for hosting us today, and to Tammy Back, who makes everything happen behind the scenes. Today's talk is about fans and fandom, and I just would like to say that I'm a huge fan of SWAM Library and of William & Mary Libraries. And I've really missed being in SWAM this year. It's always a place with such wonderful energy. It's such a lively space, and I'm sorry that we're not together today in person in the Badatat Gallery, but the silver lining here is that there are people from all over the world joining us today, and that's incredibly exciting. I see a friend from Freshman Hall who's now living in London, for instance. That's amazing. So thank you. I wanted to just preface today's talk by saying that I am aware that we have a very broad audience today, which is terrific. And so I plan to talk about my book in a way that won't get too theoretical or too much in the weeds of the research, but I will touch on some of the core ideas that guided my research. And this is my LeVar Burton Reading Rainbow moment here. If you hear something that you're interested in, I hope that you'll read the book and explore that further. And then I would love to hear from you and hear your thoughts and your questions if you do. I genuinely would love to get an email from you with any questions or thoughts. My plan today is to give you an overview of the book and share a couple of the core ideas that I explore. And then I'll go into a bit more depth with a short reading from one chapter where I discuss evidence of how Austen was viewed in the first half of the 19th century that can help us see emerging features of the fandom that may feel very familiar to any Austen lovers who are here today. And then I'll talk about some additional characteristics of the fandom that I noticed that emerged as themes throughout my research. So I've got some slides to share, and I will be coming in and out of the PowerPoint for a little variety. So I'll start that now. Oh, it disappeared on me. Try that again. Oh, Zoom. Just when we think we know what we're doing, throw us for a loop. Here we go. So my research began with the question, how far back can we trace what is recognized today as Jane Austen fandom? And how have the habits of fans changed over time in terms of the way that fans interact with Austen's novels and with each other? And it may be easy to think that fandom began with this moment. But in fact, evidence of Austen fandom over time demonstrates what I see as remarkable continuity over roughly 200 years. And it did not, in fact, sadly, begin with Colin Firth's wet shirt, although that was certainly it's been described as the big bang of Austen fandom. So it did have a big impact. There are lots of different ways that fans participate in a fandom. In the book, I trace the long history of Jane Austen fandom by focusing on three main ways that fans engage with and experience the literature that they love. There are other ways too, but these are the three that I focus on. The first is through collecting. Fans collect objects and materials related to Austen, such as books and ephemera, and fans collect knowledge about Austen and her world. In particular, I focus on 4 individuals who collected print material into scrapbooks, like the one you see an image from here, as a way of garnering objects together and knowledge. A second way that fans engage with Austen is through the reading and writing of imitative works, such as spin-off novels or fan fiction, and through watching and engaging with film adaptations and spin-offs. And a third way is through various types of pilgrimage that can help you come closer to Austen's world. Even as the media that fans harness and the social spaces that they inhabit have changed over time, and even as Austen fans have moved into online spaces, the practices and the habits of fans, the ways fans engage with Austen's works, have in many ways remained rather stable over time. In addition, I found continuity in certain features or characteristics of the Austen fandom. So for instance, nostalgia plays a fairly important role for fans. It's a longing both for the fictional world of the novels and film adaptations, as well as for a particular and somewhat selective view of the past. Austen's novels were first published between 1811 and 1817. But as early as the 1830s and 1840s, they were already being viewed through a nostalgic lens that saw her novels as representing an unspoiled past in a moment when industrialization was really taking off and changing people's everyday lives. This nostalgia is clearly visible throughout the fandom's history, and it plays out in complicated ways. Today, I'm going to talk about the Austen fandom by focusing on characteristics of the fandom, like the role of nostalgia, that are apparent throughout its history. So what is fandom exactly? I should briefly note that I am using the word fan quite broadly today as a shorthand of sorts, but I include under this term folks who love Austen and might refer to themselves with other terms like enthusiast, or in some cases even scholar. That's a whole different talk. I like to describe fandom as a playground where fans can explore a world alternative to their own. It's a place for playfulness and for escape. And in that alternative world, through certain practices and in social spaces, fans' fears, desires, problems, and realities are worked out, underscored, or sometimes ruptured even. And in that playground, other fears and desires and realities can be set aside or ignored. So fans use a variety of tactics to do this in the way that they engage with their beloved texts, to selectively find pleasure in this alternative world of the fandom. You might at this point be wondering, why on earth is the book titled Performing Jane? So throughout the book, I foreground ways that performance and performativity, or what we might say is the quality of performance-ness, how this makes space for and enables these desires and these activities of fans. The word performance has become polysemous most recently. It carries several meanings now. The idea of something being a performance currently often carries connotations of fakeness. However, I think it's really important to remember that to perform something actually is to bring something into existence. It's an iteration. So I apply this idea of performativity to help understand the ways that fans engage in meaningful, pleasurable experiences, often that come through reliving and reviving a favorite text or an experience with a text. Many of the things that fans do, rereading books, rewatching films, reading fan fiction, these are habits that are built upon repetition, which is also central to the iterative nature of performance. So that is, fans desire to experience again and again the pleasures that come from engaging with an author and a fictional world that they love. And by viewing the habits of fans as performative, it can help us to see how fans create spaces and experiences where they can be creatively reflective and where they can explore that alternative world and create for themselves or iterate for themselves a new reality that's a little bit of an escape from everyday life. I'm going to come back to the main screen here so I can see your lovely faces again. So why does any of this matter? Why study fandom? I think the importance and the influence of Jane Austen is undeniable, and that's been very, very well studied. There are lots of books that attempt to address why exactly Austen has had such lasting appeal. And probably Professor Wheatley could speak to that much more eloquently than I could. This is not really the purview of my book. Instead, I'm interested in understanding audiences, the readers, the viewers of Austen novels and adaptations, and how their habits and their interactions with this literature and with Austen's world, how that happens, how that works. And most people are fans of something, right? And by fans, I don't mean a casual appreciation. I mean something that we obsessively, consistently follow and immerse ourselves in. And that could be sports or Marvel movies or Star Wars or a musical artist. Fandom is widespread, right? It might feel like a product of maybe the last 50 or 60 years, but it does in fact have much older roots. And so my study of Austen fandom helps us understand these origins and gives us a way of understanding certain phenomena related to the reception of literature. How does literature become a part of someone's life in a meaningful way. Now, earlier I mentioned that there are several features of Austen fandom that are visible throughout the fandom's history, such as the role that nostalgia plays. And I'm now going to talk about a couple of those features. And the first is this. Fans of Austen have always felt a keen sense of personal attachment to Jane and her characters. And note that they are often called Janeites, right? Many of us in this room would perhaps use that label on ourselves. In the mid 20th century, the American literary critic Lionel Trilling actually complained very bitterly that Austen was being read in an objectionable manner, and even illicit manner. Those are his words, and not within, as he said, the proper confines of literature. And he complained that readers were loving Austen in a, quote, extravagantly personal manner. So this sense of personal attachment to a beloved author is not actually unique to Austen. 19th and early 20th century readers, and even earlier, were recognized and sometimes censured for personal obsession with authors. So Walt Whitman, for instance, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, they inspired avid fans who sought personal connections to them. But what's unique about Austen is that this trend has long outlived her. We still hear readers talk about Dear Jane and see evidence of fans feeling a real kinship with Austen's characters, like Lizzie Bennet or Anne Elliot, or even wishing for their own Mr. Darcy. As far as I know, Walt Whitman is not still receiving fan mail, so to speak. He's wonderful and all, but Austen, in a sense, is still receiving fan mail, right? We still see this personal attachment to Austen and to her world that has never waned and is visible all the way back to the 1830s. So in my second chapter of the book, I talk about the way Jane Austen began to circulate within the American cultural imagination in the 1830s and 1840s. This was a moment when her novels were gradually becoming more widely available to more readers. And so I examined periodicals and print media for mentions of Austen and her novels that could tell us a little bit about how she was received and how she was being read at that time. And I found discussions of Austen that demonstrate features of the Austen fandom that are still visible today, including evidence of this sense of personal attachment to Austen, that first name basis devotion to Jane Austen and her characters. So I thought I would read some excerpts from chapter 2 that offer allusions to Austen and reviews of her works that appeared in early American periodicals and that can help us trace these early features of the fandom, even long before the word fan was even used to describe this phenomenon. In addition to the personal attachment that is on display here, I also argue that by praising Austen's novels in these periodicals, the contributors to the periodicals were displaying, or as I argue, they were performing an alliance with what Austen represented to readers, which is another feature of the fandom that is still visible today. By reading Austen and then by praising Austen in this very public forum, readers could align themselves with the social mores that 19th century readers felt her books upheld. Take a pause for water. And what I've done here is I've created some slides that will allow us to I'm going to read this portion of this chapter has lots of quotes from the primary sources, and rather than me interrupting myself with quote unquote every time there's a bit of quoted language, I'm going to put them on the screen for smoother reading. Nearly all the reviews and mentions of Austen's novels found in 19th century periodicals emphasize the goodness, morality, and sensibleness of the novels, not just their quality. That they could educate as well as amuse and lacked objectionable material, coarse satire or sensationalism, made the novels suitable for the widest possible readership. The traces of Austen in American periodicals reveal the role of the novels in readers' lives, suggesting that reading Austen in Victorian America was a performance of virtue. Moreover, discussions of Austen's novels in taste-making periodicals enacted a performance of the praising of virtue by applauding Austen's character and the quality of her writing. This anticipates a feature of today's fandom, that aligning oneself with Austen is a means of signifying attributes society associates with Austen's works. And because I'm excerpting here, let me just interrupt myself to explain that periodicals in the first part of the 19th century in America were incredibly influential and very widely read. In April 1827, a piece from the English magazine Blackwoods, offering a beautiful eulogium upon female authors, appeared in several different American periodicals. It exclaimed, "Oh, sirs, what a glorious galaxy of female genius and virtue have we to gaze on with admiration, pure and unreproved in our native hemisphere." Among the stars in this galaxy, the editor named Jane Austen, as well as several other contemporary writers whose names are much less familiar today, all of whom bring together genius and virtue, and religion and morality, and gentleness and purity. This style of describing an author's virtue and morality, typical of attitudes toward sentimental fiction and its writers, appears in most descriptions of Austen's writing found in periodicals throughout the century. In 1834, the Literary Inquirer stated, "The works of Jane Austen have quietly won their way to the public heart, as all works of genius will." Already, Austen was being viewed as superior to other novelists. Miss Austen's works may safely be recommended not only as among the most unexceptionable of their class, but as combining in an eminent degree instruction and amusement. In 1837, the esteemed authoress was highly recommended by the editors of Lady's Book, which would later be Godey's Lady's Book, who claimed, "A good novel is a picture of life which a young lady may study to advantage." The Lady's Book credited the genius of Austen's novels to the fact that the author was a good person, whose disposition and character was, as a woman, perfect. Austen's works are a picture of excellence. Read them, young lady. The novels of Miss Austen should have their place in your library beside the moral essays of Miss Hannah More. One will convince the understanding of the beauty of virtue, the other will draw the heart to practice it. Contributors to periodicals who admired Austen's novels applauded her character as well as talents as a means of performing their own alignment with Victorian values. As early as 1838, periodicals began to employ rhetoric that commended Austen's creative genius and revealed a personal attachment to the novelist. These novels of Jane Austen I have read thrice, each time with renewed pleasure, wrote a contributor to the American Review, a Whig journal. They are always charming. I take them up in happy moments and they cheer me in unhappy ones, for sorrow comes to all. Even in solitude, they introduce you to the most agreeable company, for all Jane Austen's characters are either old friends or persons that you are confident are living somewhere on the earth. They seem to be in the very room with you. Like any good fan, this Austen lover rereads the novels and is especially drawn to them in emotional times, both happy and poignant, finding comfort in old friends who seem very real. The contributor speculated fondly about the creator of these characters. Miss Austen could never have written this sweet story of love, Mansfield Park, without having experienced it herself with all its rapturous enjoyments and torturing fears. By the 1840s, Austen's name was well enough known to avid readers of literature that the North American Review could drop her name by way of comparison to a brand new work, without needing to first explain who she was or to remind readers of what she had written. She had simply become Miss Austen, dear Miss Austen, who never says a brilliant thing, nor paints a perfect character, who is neither witty nor passionate nor eloquent, is still minute, homelike, and true. And by these qualities alone, she twines about the inmost fibers of her readers' hearts. This is Austen viewed as an old friend, flawed but beloved for simple qualities rather than greatness or brilliance. This review depicts Austen not as a great genius on her pedestal, but as deeply familiar and well-worn as one of us. Periodicals of the 1830s discussed Austen in a manner that set the stage for a fandom to emerge in the 1840s. Even though the public would know very little about her until 1870, adoration of Austen was already strong by this time, and the language used to describe her works, particularly in the 1840s, reads like the rapturous outpourings of today's fans and enthusiasts. These lovers of Jane Austen, writing in the pages of widely circulated periodicals, performed their own good taste and virtue. By performing praise of Austen's novels as well as her character, they aligned themselves with the Victorian ideals she represented to the reading public. So here, I think we start to see another key feature of the Austen fandom that I'd like to mention, and that is an air of respectability that pervades Austen's world and therefore has served to protect Austen fans from the sort of derision that we sometimes see levied at fans of other bodies of work. Early Austen fans used ideas about the novelist's morality and the decency of her work to support their claims of respectability in the face of criticism directed at them by a society that was becoming increasingly ambivalent about novels and uncomfortable with a growing fascination with them, particularly with young women. But we see this playing out today as well. Although fandom has in recent years become more visible, more mainstream, particularly with the internet, there remains a sense that some fandoms and their activities are more acceptable than others in the view of mainstream society. I'm sure you can picture the kinds of negative stereotypes that can surround certain fandoms and aspects of fandom. So imagine concerns over girls who were early Beatles fans, or stereotypes of nerdy Star Trek fans, or fans of the Twilight series who were treated with real derision for their obsession with a world that they had fallen in love with. So there are several reasons, I think, why Austen fans are mostly shielded from these criticisms, even when they engage in activities like dressing in costumes that mainstream society will sometimes view as strange or problematic or childish. So first of all, as we just heard in the reading, there is Jane Austen's reputation, her own reputation, and that helps add this air of respectability that, not all fandoms enjoy. And this is related to the way that the novels have enjoyed a position as literature, capital L, literature. Even though, Austen circulates very comfortably in pop culture, she's also clearly part of the literary canon, right? Which gives the work certain cultural credibility. And then third, I think, many of the Austen fans that I interacted with in my research and whose creative fan works I studied, they participate in the fandom through modes that often resemble professional work or scholarly work. So while they are playing in the fandom, in that playground of fandom, that play often resembles a certain form of respectable labor, like scholarship and research. And it is in fact through performativity where we see these respectability politics, if you will, sort of playing out. Fans use selective performative tactics in social spaces, like at fan events, to mitigate anxieties over what's considered appropriate behavior, right? So if a fan space is coded as a performance, then it becomes more acceptable to put on a Regency costume as a way of celebrating Austen and as a way of aligning oneself with a particular way of celebrating Austen. So this brings me to the final characteristic of Austen fandom that I would like to discuss today. There is an ongoing conversation in the interdisciplinary field of fan studies about what are viewed as two opposing modes of engaging with texts. Scholars tend to view fan activities, and particularly creative works such as fan fiction and fan art, as taking two predominant forms, affirmational and transformational. Both of them involve the same types of activities, but they each use different tactics. Transformational fandom is thought to subvert intended meanings and mainstream readings of a text. So fans will use transformative tactics to rework source material to meet their own desires and preferences. Transformative fan creations will often fix a frustrating issue with a text. For instance, romantically pairing two characters together who are not actually a couple in the world or canon of the text. Or they'll diverge from a plot twist that fans wish had not happened, like bringing back a character who was killed off in a TV show. In addition, transformative fan tactics also can make space for alternative viewpoints and identities not represented in the original text. Creative fan works that use transformational tactics make room within the world of the text for individuals not represented by the original, such as in fan fiction that recasts a straight character as queer or turns a white character into a character of color. Now, on the other hand, affirmational tactics reaffirm and restate the core ideas and norms and central concepts that are found in the original. Affirmational fandom tends to more conservatively uphold rather than challenge the core narratives and messages of the original text. Transformational fandom has definitely been much more widely studied by scholars, but I found that the Austen fandom and its prevailing practices are in fact largely affirmational. They predominantly reaffirm and restate the core narratives and norms in Austen's novels rather than challenge them. And this is somewhat unusual amongst fandoms. Most fandoms are predominantly transformative. Now, I should qualify all of this by saying that these categories have been challenged recently and increasingly, and rightly, by scholars who are questioning just how transformative a lot of fandom actually is, when it still generally upholds certain hegemonic norms and power structures, even as it challenges other ones. And so fandoms can actually be quite hostile to certain kinds of transformative practices, particularly where race is concerned. These categories are always under debate, which is great. This is what scholarship is for, right? All right, let me bring my PowerPoint back up. So to speak to that, Austen fans often enjoy fan creations and spin-offs that play with irony and enjoy incongruous representations of Regency manners. For instance, you see on the screen a GIF from Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, where the Bennet sisters are well trained in the martial arts. This is a way to pry open the text, but the fans don't go so far as to overtly resist the social mores and norms of Austen's world, or even of their own world. Instead, they often embrace the strict customs and manners of the Regency era, even as they have fun with those norms. So it creates a really fun and playful milieu. Let me give you just a couple of examples. First, fan fiction. Readers who want more Jane Austen or to have that re-experiencing of reading the texts can have the option to read retellings and spin-offs of the novels. And they will often turn to writing and reading fan fiction, which is available lots of different places online, including, as you see here, self-published on Amazon. Compared to most other fandoms, though, Austen fan fiction is actually relatively staid. It's not nearly as racy as most. In fact, most of the sites that host Austen fan fiction online, specifically and limited to just Austen or Regency era fan fiction, have very strict community standards that require writers to stay within the bounds of what was considered appropriate in the Regency period. So there are barely like stolen kisses or things like that, let alone the kinds of explicit sexual content that you find in most fan fiction. The fan site Archive of Our Own, which has recently surpassed fanfiction.net as the largest repository of fanfiction online, it puts virtually no restrictions on the content that fans can post. But even still, currently, only about 15% of fanfiction related to Pride and Prejudice is marked as mature or explicit. And these are categories that mostly refer to sexual content, but sometimes also mature themes like addiction or suicide, things like that. This is considerably less. That 15% is considerably less than in most fandoms or many fandoms. So if a fan were looking for a sexually explicit story involving, for instance, Darcy and Elizabeth, Archive of Our Own is where fans would tend to find it. However, even those stories don't pose much of a challenge to the norms of Austen's time. They are, again, very affirmational. When they include sexual content, they tend to use plot devices to ensure that it doesn't challenge the expectations of Regency society. So for instance, it might take place on a character's wedding night or be explained away as having just been a dream or something like that. In addition, there are relatively few stories posted even on Archive of Our Own that bring transformative elements into Austen's world, such as crossovers with other texts, such as Pride and Prejudice and Harry Potter mashed up together, or queer pairings between characters. It's just really very uncommon in the Austen fandom and much more common in most other fandoms. On the Jane Austen fanfiction sites specifically, the ones that only host Austen-related fanfiction, the whole point of these very carefully curated sites is to offer fans stories that attempt to recreate as exactly as possible the experience of reading Austen's novels. So these, the transformative tactics that I talked about are very deliberately avoided in these cases. Similarly, on the social media site Tumblr, which I studied in detail for my research, this offers fans another very affirmational space in which they can relive and re-experience favorite moments from film adaptations through visual fan creations that use GIFs, right? Repeating images that are short clips of film that repeat. These are celebrations of Austen's world, and they seek to sort of take a favorite moment from a film adaptation and distill it, and then to share that moment with others who will likewise find comfort or joy or excitement in these moments. But again, they affirm rather than challenge these moments and their meanings, even when they are manipulated playfully through clever editing. So here's an example. This is from a gift set based on the 2005 film adaptation of Pride and Prejudice that starred Keira Knightley. And here we see how one fan has captured a brief but particularly charged moment on screen. The fan who created this gift set has made edits using the visual language of Tumblr to really condense this moment and to amplify the original meaning, but without altering it. And you'll have to forgive me because with limitations of technology, this is a screenshot. So typically on Tumblr, these would be in motion. All 4 of these images would be in motion, but here all we get is stills, but you can use your imagination. The scene in the film from which this gift set is taken focuses on a brief but very intense moment of contact between Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth Bennet as he hands her into a carriage, and it's before they start to sort of like each other, at least realize they start to like each other. And the moment hinges on a close-up of their hands touching, followed by rapid intercuts that reveal each character's reaction to this encounter. The creator of this Tumblr post has cropped and tightened each of the frames to really emphasize the intensity and the intimacy of the moment, and has chosen to render these GIFs in black and white. This is an effect that I think really highlights the stark contrast between these two characters and their views toward each other at that point in the story. The original feeling the scene elicits is therefore captured, and it's reframed, which then allows viewers to experience this really delicious moment of sexual tension in a slightly new way. Again, it's that desire for repetition, to re-experience and re-access a favorite text and an experience with that text. I see this affirmational approach as resembling that that performance of virtue that comes from aligning oneself with Austen and her world that I talked about with the examples from 19th century periodicals. I think for the women, well, it's mostly women in the fandom who love Austen today, I think engaging through affirmational fandom with the world of these novels allows for a strategic move toward that alternative world, that playground. It's a kind of time travel, right? That lets fans explore something distinct from their everyday life, even if, or maybe especially because, the distinctions they get to explore there don't overtly challenge dominant power structures and cultural norms. So I hope that this talk has given you a sense of some of the characteristics of the Austen fandom and some of the ways that fans engage with the world that they love. And I'm incredibly grateful again to you for being here today. Thanks for listening. Thanks again to the William and Mary Libraries folks, to Dean Carey Cooper for hosting today. I would also like to acknowledge everyone at LSU Press. I know LB Kovac is here today. Hi, LB, thanks for being here. And acknowledge my wonderful editor, Jenny Keegan. Working with LSU Press has been really such a fantastic experience. They have an amazing catalog of books. They have strong series in poetry, Southern history, Louisiana studies, their social justice issues. They're a really terrific press. And they currently have a 40% off sale for all of their books. So if you go straight to LSU Press's website, you'll find this button that's there. I encourage you to explore their catalog. So thank you again very much. And I'm more than happy to take some questions.
Yes, we have some questions in the chat, Sarah. And yes, great talk. Thank you so much. I'm going to start with the first one that came in from LB. What do you think Austen's fandom will look like 200 years from now?
That is such a great question. Wow. Well, if history is any indication, I think it'll look a lot like it does now. I mean, again, what I found in looking at all these different modes, all this different evidence from the 19th century, from the 20th century, the 21st century, even as modes change, right? The internet changed everything, but the way people are interacting with each other to celebrate literature that they love has not really changed, right? So I think it'll look a lot like it does now. And can you imagine Austen not continuing to be popular? She has been a voice that has resonated with so many people globally. The Austen fandom, and I don't get into this particularly in this talk or even in the book, it is really global. I mean, fans, I was just in touch with a former graduate student who is from China, and she grew up reading Austen in Mandarin. I mean, right? That's amazing. So the fandom is really quite global. I focused on sort of the American fandom, but it's, yeah, I think, I can't imagine her influence waning.
Thank you. We have a question from Robert. Which comes first for fans? Is it the book or is it the author?
By which comes first, I'm assuming you mean which is the preeminent connection, as opposed to what do you get exposed to first?
I believe that's what Robert means.
Yeah, I'm assuming that's the question. So that is a really interesting question. I suspect it's the stories and the characters that comes first. And then you fall in love with the world, you fall in love with the characters, and then you want to know more. And one of the first things people want to know more about is, well, who wrote this, right? And what's really interesting about 19th century, the emerging fandom that I see in the 19th century, is that, really we knew very little about Jane Austen until 1870. I alluded to that in the talk. 1870, her nephew, great nephew, I don't know, Professor Wheatley, maybe correct me if I misspeak on any of these things. Remember, I'm a cultural studies person, not an Austen scholar, so I don't always get the Austen details right.
It's her nephew, James Edward Austen Lee.
There you go. Her nephew published a memoir that then helped give us a biographical picture of who she was as a woman, how she wrote, where she wrote. So we have all of these sort of iconic ideas about, you know, Jane at this little table. You know, sometimes if you can Google this, you can look at if you visit Chawton in the UK, there's this little table where she sat and wrote, and wonderful stories about that. And so, you know, but people were even before we knew all of this stuff, even before 1870, people were reading these novels and then feeling this intense attachment to Jane, even though all we knew was a very brief biographical sketch about her that was printed in periodicals after she died, just basically a brief obituary that told us virtually nothing, right? But I suspect, to answer Robert's question, it's the stories, right? We fall in love with stories and characters.
Thank you. From a question from Catherine, how, if at all, do you think the publishing order of Jane Austen books shaped the nature of the fandom in its path?
Wow, that's a really interesting question. I think, you know, this sort of goes back to what we were just talking about. I think, you know, it's going to come down to what order do you discover the books in? And in terms of the circulation of the novels in America, as I mentioned, they really didn't become particularly widely available until 1830s. There were more editions that were more affordable, 1840s more again, 1850s and 60s, and there were cheaper editions becoming available. So her readership grew and grew and grew. But it's hard to know how the order of the publication may have impacted that. That is a really great question. I'm writing that down because I don't have a good answer for you. I don't know that it's easy to trace either.
So there's been a little bit of talk in the chat about Bridgerton. I don't know if you saw Bridgerton, Sarah, but some people in the chat have seen it. There's a little bit of talk about that. So LB asks, do you think Pride and Prejudice or another Austen book will ever get a Bridgerton style reboot, either in terms of raciness or its approach to race? Or do you think Austen fans would embrace this type of reboot?
Oh, wow. Okay, there are like 5 questions in there.
Yeah, there's a lot in there.
Okay, how much time do we have left here? Yeah, so I am prepared for this question. I watched Bridgerton because I was like, people are going to ask me about this and I better be ready. So I watched it and I found it immensely entertaining. It's been one of those, I mean, it was a huge hit for Netflix, right? It's like their biggest streaming thing ever, which is amazing for fans of Regency romance. So Bridgerton is based on these novels that are Regency romance. They're from the romance genre. I think one of the things, you know, the critics of Bridgerton are trying to compare it to Austen, but it's not Austen, and it's not necessarily even trying to be Austen. It's a completely different genre. It's romance novels, and I found them immensely entertaining. So the question about will there be adaptations that sex up Austen and bring in a sort of more modern casting choices. So we've seen a little bit of this. We've had a taste of this already with the recent Sanditon adaptation. Sanditon is Jane Austen's, it's the novel she was writing when she died. So it's a fragment that's left. I think it's 11 or 12 chapters that remained. Fairly drafty, I think. You can read it for yourself. Several people have tried to finish it. Wait, hold on. I can grab a prop here. Here's one. So it has been finished by a couple of people, Jane Austen and another lady, anonymously here. We know who she is. And then there was an adaptation that Andrew Davies turned his hand to. He was the writer behind the 1995, the Colin Firth Pride and Prejudice. And what's interesting about Sanditon is that there is a character of color that Jane Austen wrote. And in Andrew Davies' adaptation, she is the richest woman in any room she walks into. She's an heiress with 100,000 pounds. She's immensely rich. She like puts Mr. Darcy to shame, right? So she is this incredible character, and she has a romantic interest who is also a Black character. And they were wonderful and lively. If you haven't watched Sanditon, I would recommend it. It's a great adaptation. It's 8 episodes. It starts with what we do have as the fragments of Jane Austen's unfinished novel, and then finished with Andrew Davies' imagination. And it is also a little bit sexy because there is some on-screen implied sexual activity. It's nothing graphic, but it's there. We also see Theo James in the nude from behind, especially in the British version. Pro tip there for you. So it is already sort of a version that kind of, adds these elements to the adaptation that you often don't see. Now, some people loved this and some people found it abhorrent. So you're going to get a mix of responses. And some of this comes down to, when people want to watch Jane Austen, it's comfort food, right? It's something we turn to when we, I've heard from lots of people this year who have reread the novels during the pandemic, right? We turn to Austen when we seek comfort, and we want our comfort food, our comfort entertainment to fill the role that we expect it to. And so some people found Sanditon to be, it didn't do what they wanted it to. It was too sexy, too modernized. And the same critique we see thrown at Bridgerton too. There is going to be a Persuasion adaptation that has cast a Black actor, and I'm blanking on his name. He's in Game of Thrones. He's terrific. And there was a very divided response, right? So some people were like, oh, I love him. Last name is Fry, maybe. If somebody knows who I'm talking about, wants to throw the name in the chat, go for it. But then we had the racists come out of the woodwork and say, oh, he's so wrong for the role. And it's just like the discourse around this becomes clearly it's just racism. So you do get these really mixed responses to these modern casting choices. Of course, there are also modern adaptations, right? Retellings of Pride and Prejudice and Emma, like think about Clueless, right? Clueless is a beloved modernized adaptation, Amy Heckerling's adaptation from, I don't know what year, 95 maybe, I'd have to look it up. And it's still beloved. I think it's on Netflix now again. So yeah, you do get mixed responses to these choices.
Thanks, Sarah. So one person asked, what is your favorite adaptation?
I'm a huge fan of the 1995 Persuasion. I'm a sucker for that one.
That's my favorite.
But I mean, ask me tomorrow, and if I've just watched something else, I might say something else too. So
I think that's a good pick. John asks, how do you think the fandom has evolved as we get farther and farther from Jane Austen's time period?
Yeah, well, I mean, for one, it's grown exponentially, right? And so in tracing its history, we see these moments, these big bang moments that happen. So 1870 was one, right? Suddenly there's biographical information about Austen. There was already a desire to know more about her when that memoir from her nephew came out in 1870. So it's not like that book spurned it on, but suddenly there was something to feed that desire to know more about Austen. So that's a big moment that really propelled more interest in Austen. Then you've got another set of newly illustrated editions came out 1890s, I want to say. I'd have to double check the date on that. That also then like grew her popularity again. The 1940 Lawrence, what's his name? The adaptation 1940 adaptation from MGM. Also huge big bang moment for Austen fandom. Suddenly it's our first screen adaptation in 1940. And so suddenly characters who had lived only in people's minds were on screen, and like it's beautiful and lavish. And it just really propelled folks' imagination. And so, so I think as we see these moments, each of these moments, the 1995, the Colin Firth wet shirt, right, the the 2005 Pride and Prejudice, each of these moments where there's something that really captures the audience's attention and imagination, it adds, it sort of layers, it's this accretion over time of more layers to the fandom. So, but again, I don't see the characteristics of the fandom changing that much over time. The ways people are reading and enjoying and sharing this love of Austen with each other have remained really stable over time. It's just that we get these new layers and these new audiences, right? So folks who were of a certain age and maybe were too young or not even born yet for the 1995, were exposed to Pride and Prejudice through the 2005. I mean, it's only a difference of 10 years, but it made a huge difference, right? And so for some people, the Colin Firth is the version, and for others, the Colin, what's his name, McFadden, Matthew McFadden is the version, right? And so you get these little growth spurts that happen. But the beautiful thing is the common thread of just really loving this world, her world and her words and her prose and her characters and the humor, right? And so that has remained really stable over time. I imagine it won't change.
So Carrie has a question. Can you talk about your research for the book? Do you have a favorite archives experience?
I do have a favorite archives experience. I will tell you a story. I was starting to try to research the origins of the Jane Austen Society of North America, and I was looking at all of the founding members, and I was just Googling the names of the list of people who were at the very first meeting of the Jane Austen Society of North America to see who might I be able to reach out to interview and talk to. And one of the, I'm hitting down the list, and I put in the name George Holbert Tucker into Google, and the very first URL, the very first search item that came up caught my eye because it was a William and Mary link. And I went, special collections, what? And then it turns out that our own special collections on my own campus had this amazing treasure trove of the George Holbert Tucker collection, which is like 119 volumes of research scrapbooks. And it's amazing. It's very idiosyncratic and kind of odd, but like delightful. And he was charming. And he took his whole research collection and donated it to William and Mary because, and there's this lovely quote that's in the collection file that says, he always respected and liked Dr. Swem, who our library is named for, and we always had a good laugh together. And it's so charming, but it's a great collection. Of course, doing work in your own special collections library is pretty special. I also did archival research at Goucher College. They have an amazing Jane Austen collection there that, anyone's welcome to make an appointment and go see, modulo any pandemic changes right now. But yeah, that the finding as I'm trying to initially do research, finding something so wonderful in my own backyard that became an entire chapter of my dissertation that's my favorite research experience.
Is that a good place for me to step in, do you think, Tammy?
Yeah, I think that might be.
I didn't ask that because I thought you would say us. I really didn't. But that's a great story, and I'm glad to know it. Sarah, this has been so much fun. Thank you so much for planning today, preparing such a beautiful talk, and for promoting it to the people that you know. I don't think we've had many talks that have been this high. We've had, I think, up to more than 120 people on the call at one point. So it's really exciting, and it's wonderful to gather with everybody here today in this way. So thanks so much. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Carrie. Thank you, everyone, for being here. It's been my pleasure.